You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to News Talks, a Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss some of the biggest news stories in global higher ed right now. I'm Miranda Prynne, and joining me today is our Deputy News Editor, Helen Packer. Hi Helen, welcome to News Talks.
Hello.
Now, this week you obtained figures from the Higher Education Statistics Agency, Hesa, which show a steep rise in the number of international students enrolled in Masters by Research courses at certain English universities. As a standalone fact, this sounds fairly innocuous, so why is it important? Well, for background, ever since the UK government banned international students from bringing their dependents to the UK with them, which came into force in January 2024, there have been rumbling suspicions over whether certain English universities were exploiting a so-called loophole in student visa rules that allow international students who are enrolled in these Masters by Research or MRes courses to bring their dependents, so that could be their spouse or their children, to the UK with them. So, Helen, talk us through these new figures.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, a lot of the data we've got is from Hesa, but we've also collected some additional data through Freedom of Information requests. And together, what this confirms is something that I think was largely an open secret in the sector before, that a small number of institutions, and it's important to say it is a small number of institutions, it's not the overall sector at all, but these universities have been growing the number of international students enrolled on their research masters courses at quite staggering rates. So to give a couple of examples, the data from Hesa shows that the University of Greater Manchester, which was previously known as the University of Bolton, went from having no international students on these courses in 2022-23 to having 915 in 2024-25, which is the latest the Hesa data goes up to. Similarly, the University of Lancashire went from 260 to 850 in the same time period, and Wolverhampton went from 0 to 770. So we've also managed to get some more up-to-date information from this year. So, for example, the University of Hertfordshire has launched a whole new suite of these programmes this academic year, and they've enrolled 581 international students in the first year. The other university that's seen significant growth this year is York St John, which rose from one MRes student in 2023-24 to 387 this year.
Wow, those are big rises. Do you have a total figure to represent the overall change across the sector?
Yeah, so for MRes courses, what we saw is that before 2024, which is when the dependence ban came in, the total number was relatively stable. So for international students, it kind of hovered around 2,500. Specifically in 2023-24, it was 2,485. And according to the Hesa data, in 2024-25, so after the ban, it really shot up to 6,085. So yeah, quite significant growth there in just 1 year.
Critics will say that this is clear evidence that universities are indeed using MRes courses as a workaround to the visa crackdown and to ultimately get more international students through their doors. What are the universities in question saying?
So, I mean, to start with, it's worth saying that the universities are absolutely allowed to do this. They're not breaking any rules. And what we've seen is that demand from international students for these courses has also increased. So the universities say they're responding to this demand, and they say they take immigration compliance very seriously. They also defend the rigour and the value of these courses. There have been some questions about that, given, how quickly they've been developed and grown. And although the numbers may seem large, they're not always huge in comparison to wider student numbers. So at Hertfordshire, for example, they said these international students on their MRes courses actually represent 3% of the university's entire international student population.
Of course, there are big research-intensive universities which have always welcomed a fairly large number of international MRes students, such as UCL or Imperial. Do these new big intakes of MRes students at the institutions you've named, so Greater Manchester, Lancashire, Wolverhampton, for instance, now outstrip numbers at universities which have traditionally welcomed larger numbers in this area?
Yeah, so in terms of the pure number of students, the universities I mentioned are the ones with the highest numbers. So they do have higher numbers than kind of your traditional research universities, which obviously some people think is concerning. But saying that, research universities have also been growing these numbers as you would probably expect them to, though perhaps not quite at the same scale.
As you say, it is important to remember that these institutions are not breaking any rules. They're not technically doing anything wrong. But what's the general consensus among policymakers and politicians on this issue?
I think the feeling is that what's happening isn't really in the spirit of the rules, even if they're not technically doing anything wrong. When the new rules around dependence were introduced, these MRes courses were exempt because the international student numbers on them had always been relatively small and relatively steady. They weren't growing before this. And they were really seen as a pathway for top talent to come to the UK. So typically, students on these courses might continue on to a PhD, for example. So from the start, when it set out this exemption, the Home Office was really clear that it won't look kindly on institutions taking advantage of it. And we know that it's constantly keeping student visa rules under review. Specifically, when we put these numbers to the Home Office, officials from there said they will go further if they believe there's abuse in the system.
So that's something that the sector as a whole does need to keep in mind. Just stepping back from the numbers for a moment, one of the other controversies relating to this leap in international MRes students is the nature of certain overseas student recruitment campaigns or marketing campaigns and how these courses are being advertised. Why is this raising eyebrows?
I think it's worth saying that concerns around how courses are advertised overseas aren't isolated to MRes courses. I think it's a long-standing issue that the sector grapples with. For these courses, what we've seen is a small number of education agents. And again, it's important to say it's not all education agents by any means, it's a very small number of them. But they're advertising these courses in a way that is quite damaging to the sector. So rather than selling the courses on their own merits, they're telling students that enrolling in these courses is a way for them to bring their families to the UK, which understandably is appealing to students who might be married or have children. But this is obviously quite damaging to universities, as they don't want to look like they're selling this as an immigration route. So we know that most universities don't tolerate this behaviour from the agents they work with and are very clear that agents shouldn't be doing this. I've certainly never seen any examples of universities directly advertising courses in this way. But given the complex nature of how education agents operate, and particularly sub-agent networks, I think there are always going to be some that slip through the net.
Yes, I imagine the monitoring of that is very tricky when you've got an agent working 3 steps away potentially from the university itself.
Exactly. And I think on the other hand, the agents are just doing their job. They see their role as getting students into universities. So yeah, it's tricky.
I mean, anything, as we know, that sparks the ire of the Home Office in relation to international student visas could have very far-reaching implications for everyone in UK higher education. Do you have any sense of what others in the sector are feeling about this?
Yeah, I think the sector in general is very worried about this and frustrated. As you say, everyone is very conscious that they don't want to upset the Home Office or be seen kind of flouting rules. And I think most institutions have purposefully not been growing these courses, even though they could have given student demand, because they didn't want to, annoy the Home Office. So I think there's a lot of concern that a few institutions could ruin it for the rest. If the Home Office does act, the obvious thing to do would be to impose a blanket ban on any MRes students bringing their families, which could mean all institutions then struggle to attract these really promising students, even if they haven't been growing their courses. There's some suggestions that the Home Office needs to be more nuanced in their approach, but it seems unlikely that they're going to want to, play whack-a-mole as institutions grow these courses and others don't. It's probably worth saying, though, the Home Office does already have tools at its disposal. So it can put universities on action plans where there are concerns about immigration compliance. And we know that new compliance metrics are coming into force soon. So it may well feel, at least initially, that these tools are enough to manage this behaviour.
Yes. Some might say universities have actually been encouraged by government to act like a competitive market and to drive their own revenue. And that in serving more MRes students, they are, as you've already pointed to, simply adapting to rising demand in that area, which, given the limits on their public funding, is only sensible. Is anyone making this argument?
Absolutely, they are, although I think perhaps not as loudly as they might, given that they want to maintain a good relationship with the government and are nervous about upsetting the Home Office. But I think it's certainly something that people are thinking. And it kind of speaks to a wider contradiction in the way the sector operates. Universities, we know, are autonomous, and this is something the government consistently emphasises, including in Labour's recent post-16 skills paper. So I think there's a sense that the government is largely leaving providers to deal with their own financial problems, which, as we know, are really significant, and telling the sector that it needs to come up with its own solutions. Yet when they do, such as by expanding in-demand courses like MRes ones, they're then kind of threatened by the government and issued with these warnings. So you can see how it's quite a frustrating situation, I think.
How does the UK compare to other major higher education providers around the world in its international student visa stance?
So interestingly, I think in recent years we've seen all the big four Anglophone destinations tightening their immigration rules around international students, largely in response to the migration debates we see in the UK. But I think most of the others haven't been so fixated on dependence. That seems to be a particular concern in the UK. So in Canada and Australia, most international students can still bring their dependents with them. In Australia, spouses of students can work while they're there too, which is understandably really appealing to families, as this can help cover their living costs while they're in the country. The rules are slightly different in Canada. In general, spouses can only work if the study visa holder is studying for a postgraduate qualification. But certainly overall, there's a lot more space for students to bring their families. And I think that's a big concern for UK universities, who are worried that they are losing international students to these other countries. And the most recent visa statistics back that up, showing that international student visa applications are falling in the UK.
So the UK is actually among the strictest of the big providers on this issue, although, as you say, visa regulations are being tightened up in many places around the world. How has this ban on dependents affected the number of international students and indeed their dependents coming to the UK?
So I think it's safe to say that the numbers have fallen quite dramatically. Figures released after the ban came into force in 2024 show that the number of main applicant visas, so that's applications by students who are intending to study, fell by 6%. But specifically what we saw is that certain markets that are typically very geared towards dependents saw much bigger falls. So India, for example, saw 16% fewer main applicants granted visas and 31% fewer dependents. Similarly, Nigerian applicants fell by 39% and the number of Nigerian dependents by 40%. I think, culturally in those countries, it's not unusual for students to get married much younger than they might in the UK and have children. And, it's a hard decision for them to leave their families behind when they could go to a different country like Australia and bring them with them.
Yes, and it's easy to see why someone studying for a postgraduate course who has children and a long-term partner or spouse would want to bring them with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And overall, as you'd expect, the number of dependents has dropped very significantly. So in 2024, it dropped by 80% compared to the previous year.
Wow, yeah. So, these policies do really have a very tangible and fast impact. Does the UK government's new international education strategy, which was published in January, have any bearing on any of this?
So the international education strategy, it really focuses on growing education exports, so transnational education ventures abroad. It's not very big on bringing students to the UK. It does touch on international student recruitment, but really emphasises that this should be responsible and sustainable. So yeah, it's a far cry from the last strategy, which set a target of having 600,000 international students coming to the UK, and that figure we actually ended up reaching a decade early. So obviously the political climate has changed a lot now, and given debates around migration and the threat of reform, I think the government is very wary of publicly encouraging immigration of any sort, including students. They want to be seen to be reducing net migration and being tough on immigration, and I think that will ultimately shape their response to this new surge of MRes students.
Yes, and frankly, if the government isn't able to meet the challenge from reform, then things could get a whole lot worse for the UK higher education sector.
Absolutely.
It's probably worth saying here that overall international student numbers in the UK are down by some margin. The most recent figures showed a drop-off of 10% over 2 years between 2022 and 23 and 2024-25. And however questionable some of the strategies and practices being employed to recruit and enrol international students, many would point to the fact that universities, as Helen has alluded to, have been left with very few options. Indeed, some would say no options beyond international students to prop up their finances and to, put bluntly, pay for all their domestic students. So, with successive governments refusing to increase public funding streams over a long period, and at the same time legislating to limit the one route by which universities can make money, they are currently left with nowhere to turn other than cuts. But as the political climate remains less sympathetic to this than university leaders might hope, for now at least, it seems institutions will need to be very careful to be seen to be playing by the rules and indeed in the spirit of the rules. Helen, thank you so much for joining us this week and unpicking this subject, taking us through the figures and making sense of it all. Hopefully we'll have you back on News Talks again soon.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed listening, do like and subscribe, and we will be back with another News Talks in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.